Hello, everybody, and welcome to the July edition of Fellow Seminar at ORF. I'm Preeti Kapuria, Fellow at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at ORF. We are featuring today Bhowmick's paper, Understanding the Economic Issues in Sri Lanka's Current Debacle. Soumya is an Associate Fellow at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy. He tracks globalization economics and sustainable development. We have a diverse panel today. We are joined by Benislos Thushan and Sreya Maitra. Benislos is a young entrepreneur. He's the founder of an educational platform called Digital Storytelling based in Sri Lanka. And Sreya is an assistant professor at the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, and also associate editor of the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs. To give context to Soumya's paper, Sri Lanka is afflicted with political instability, economic meltdown, and deteriorating social conditions. The island nation is going from conditions of relative prosperity and stability to its worst economic crisis since independence. It has defaulted on its fiscal international monetary commitments and is left with little or no reserves to sustain the supply of food, fuel, electricity, and medicine. Rapid inflation has drastically reduced the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, and the demand for political accountability has only led to a clampdown on individual rights through the imposition of national emergency. Now, the origin and expansion of the crisis can be traced back to the pandemic and a series of flawed and misguided policy initiatives such as the overnight transformation to organic agriculture, lower taxation, and high levels of subsidies that have crippled agriculture production and raised the fiscal deficit to catastrophic levels. As we speak, the nation has already defaulted on its external debt and has foreign debt payments of around $4 billion due this year. To discuss in detail the crucial economic issues that have led to the Sri Lankan crisis, I will now invite Soumya to present his paper. Soumya, you have 15 minutes to make this presentation, and I'll prompt you after 10 minutes to let you know that you've got 5 more minutes to wrap up. Over to you.
Thank you, Preeti, for the kind introduction, and my greetings to the respected panelists, Sreya and Benislos. As the first slide shows, today I will be presenting my recently published paper that tries to dissect the economic crisis unfolding in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka and India go a long way, ranging from historical ties to economic partnerships. My heart reaches out to the people who have lost their lives and thousands who are suffering from the current humanitarian disaster in the island nation. With this, I start my presentation. Coming to the next slide, starting off, it is noteworthy that the South Asian neighborhood seems to be in a flux in recent times, from the unemployment situation in Myanmar to the forex crisis in Pakistan, again from the rising trade deficits in Nepal to one of the worst humanitarian disasters in South Asia's contemporary history, as shown by Sri Lanka. The lines outside the gas stations and the lack of necessary commodities such as food and medicines paint a very sad picture of what the country is going through. However, the interconnectedness in the global economy does not allow for an isolated view of the national economic emergency in Sri Lanka, which is home to a population of approximately 22 million. This paper discusses 6 interconnected economic challenges in Sri Lanka that have played an important role in this crisis. Coming to the next slide to discuss the domestic economy and tax cuts. Now, the 26-year-long civil war that ended in 2009 had a massive impact on the fundamentals of Sri Lanka's domestic economy. The global financial crisis of 2008 drained the country's forex reserves, and economic mismanagement by a succession of governments caused the twin challenges of budget shortfall as well as balance of payments deficits. Now, I am not going into the statistics that are mentioned in the slide and in my paper in detail, but rather focusing more on the series of events. Towards the end of 2019 and in early 2020, before the pandemic, the government enacted deep tax cuts in fulfillment of an election promise. This led to the loss of approximately 1 million taxpayers between 2020 and 2022, a massive challenge for an economy that was already suffering from widespread tax evasion. The huge rise in fiscal deficits was burdened even more when the pandemic played itself in 2020, with social security measures coming to the forefront. Mainstream economic theory suggests a positive impact of tax cuts in the long-term growth. However, in the case of Sri Lanka, consequences have been dire. As the situation has critically aggravated, there is need for fiscal consolidation through revenue enhancement as well as expenditure rationalization, which was done through reversal in some of these tax cuts. Finally, it is important to note that any macroeconomic restructuring, however, must be guided by the basic tenets of inclusive progress, given that the economic impact of the pandemic has been skewed towards women and poor. Now, coming to the next slide again, the table shows that tax revenues for the BIMSTEC nations, among the countries in the region, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios, which makes these tax cuts extremely problematic in the first place. In the next slide on balance of payment situation in Sri Lanka, we see the twin deficits on the current and fiscal accounts have moved together consistently since 1970, with an exception in 1977 when a current account surplus had occurred. This made the country more susceptible to exogenous shocks such as the pandemic. Now, Sri Lanka's balance of trade has also been registering a consistent deficit, with an approximately increasing trend in these deficits over the years. Historically, Sri Lanka's capital account and current account balances have moved in opposite directions. The former has always been in surplus, while the latter is characterized by prolonged deficits. The relatively slower capital account combined with the strongly deteriorating current account have led to the massive BOP crisis in Sri Lanka in recent times, and the country is finding it extremely difficult to pay for its essential commodities. In the next slide, we see the historical trends in Sri Lanka's capital account surplus and current account deficits. Now, theoretically, a capital account can have a negative impact on the current account in two ways. Firstly, a boost in capital surpluses increases investments and disposable income in the economy, because of which people tend to demand more of imported goods. So imports rises, and as a result of which the current account deteriorates. Secondly, capital inflows also has a tendency to appreciate domestic currency, which basically makes imports more cheaper, and exports expensive. Now, the increase in imports again and the decrease in exports widens the current account surplus, the current account deficits by leaps and bounds. Moving on to the IMF bailouts, the next slide discusses the IMF bailouts for Sri Lanka. The last few decades have seen a series of BOP crises in Sri Lanka, and the country has sought a number of bailouts from the IMF. The 2016 IMF package caused repercussions to the economy's health, where both growth rates and government revenues had contracted. IMF loans do come with a set of conditions that are often restrictive for the debtor nations. Sri Lanka, despite its severe BOP crisis, did not immediately seek assistance from IMF, given its previous track record of faltering economic recovery. The next slide shows Sri Lanka's IMF structural adjustment programs since the 1960s. It gives us a detail of the packages and how they were placed over the last few decades. Now, moving on to the next slide, it discusses the agricultural reforms in Sri Lanka. After the 2019 presidential election, a 10-year vision for transition into complete organic farming in Sri Lanka was outlined. However, in April 2021, the Sri Lankan government decided to completely ban the import of agrochemicals to mitigate the health impact of chemicals, to promote eco-friendly sustainable agricultural systems, and also saving up on forex to import these agrochemicals. Now, this sudden shift was like a time bomb waiting to explode. As the new methods of production were more costly with lower yields and less agricultural awareness, this disrupted the economy's self-sufficiency in rice production, and the country has since had to import rice from countries such as Myanmar and China to derail the food crisis. The tea industry, which was once a major commodity of export, incurred losses to the tune of some 425 million US dollar during this time period. The country's declining export profits and the surging imports of wheat, sugar, and milk powder and other essential items from other countries increased the demand for forex, which led to massive currency depreciation in the Lankan economy. The rising prices led to cost-push inflation, while the earlier tax cuts had increased disposable incomes, leading to demand-pull inflationary tendencies. Additionally, currency printing in Sri Lanka over the years also contributed to the inflationary pressures. Finally, in November 2021, the ban was lifted following the backlash from the industry. However, many sectors were completely razed to the ground by then. Indeed, the Sri Lankan agricultural crisis provides two very important lessons in the domain of developmental policies. Firstly, the contemporary sustainable development agenda has its own flaws, where one aspect of development often induces a negative externality to another. For instance, in terms of the SDG framework, there is no doubt that knee-jerk policies such as the one on organic farming will help advance targets of, say, SDG 13, which is climate action, but will put a huge burden on achieving SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, as is evident from the Sri Lankan case. Secondly, not all policies can be absorbed at the same pace for developing nations in comparison to the global north, mainly because of the resources gap in the foundations of the economy. Now, moving on to the next slide to add context to our discussion, we are trying to show the trend lines for the dwindling forex reserves in Sri Lanka in the recent past. In the next slide, again, we discussed Sri Lanka's tourism sector, which accounts for 12% of the country's GDP and is the fifth largest source of foreign currency in the economy. It is also responsible for direct and indirect employment of Sri Lankans, estimated to the tune of about 400,000 people as of 2019. After the Easter Sunday bombings in April 2019, many establishments stayed closed for days following the incident, and the tourists fled as the number of visitors fell by large percentages. This was followed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in a 50% revenue loss in 2020 and a consequent drop in tourist numbers. The government maintained that an honest boost in tourism and exports will assist Sri Lanka in refilling its foreign currency reserves and potentially navigate the crisis. The Sri Lankan government's ban on social media, such as Twitter and Facebook platforms in April 2022, had made tourists anxious about the country's future. Adding to the woes of the country is the Russia-Ukraine war, which crippled the country's tourism sector further. Unfortunately, Russia and Ukraine account for the top and the third largest tourist markets for Sri Lanka in early 2022 and have played a critical role in this plan. In the next slide, we show what we just discussed, the flattening trends in the tourist numbers in Sri Lanka in 2019 and in 2020.
Shomu, you have 5 minutes to go.
Moving on to the next slide, we delve into Sri Lanka's external debt structure. Before Sri Lanka's graduation to a middle-income country in the late 1990s, most of its foreign debt came in the form of concessionary funding from multilateral organizations such as World Bank, ADB, etc., which got favorable loan conditions as a low-income nation. However, as access to concessionary loans declined and the economy shifted to become a middle-income country, most of the loans were in the form of commercial borrowing. And these commercial borrowings were in the form of international sovereign bonds or ISBs, which had high interest rates, shorter durations of repayment, and no grace period. The changes in the total structure of Sri Lanka's external debt had made the economy more vulnerable to currency crisis in the last few years. Additionally, many global analysts concur that Sri Lanka has also fallen victim to China's debt trap diplomacy. Although China does not account for the highest percentage of Sri Lanka's outstanding percentage of Sri Lanka's external debts, China's liquidation techniques and hidden debts in various projects also reflect the problematic nature of Beijing's economic imperialism, such as the Hambantota port incident in 2017. Finally, on April 12, 2022, the country declared that it was defaulting on its external debts to the tune of $51 billion, pending an IMF bailout. The announcement immediately led to the crash in the market prices for the ISBs issued by the country. Fortunately, in the last few years, though, Sri Lanka and India have been able to substantially strengthen their economic ties and remain among the largest trade partners for each other within the ambit of SAARC. India has also extended its support to the island nation in various forms during the crisis. Now, coming to the next slide on Sri Lanka's foreign debt composition, the bar graphs show Sri Lanka's foreign debt composition in the last 2 decades that have shifted detrimentally from concessionary loans to commercial borrowings. Finally, coming to the concluding slide, it is important to analyze the complex interplay of these domestic and international macroeconomic factors, not only to help chart a steady recovery process for Sri Lanka, but also to establish relevant red flags for developing countries as they plan their post-pandemic economic readjustments. Number 1, economics over politics. Sri Lanka's comprehensive tax cuts in 2019 led to massive fiscal deficits, which caused unnecessary pressure on the central bank, causing a deterioration in the exchange rate situation as well as inflationary tendencies. Number 2, minding the BOP gap. When the trade structure starts featuring necessary commodities in the import basket, it is a clear signal that the country is going beyond its means. This has devastated the current account balance in Sri Lanka, leading to the BOP crisis. Number 3, employing pragmatism with the IMF. Sri Lanka's early reluctance to seek any IMF package had arguably made things worse and reduced its options to avert the current meltdown. Then, one size does not fit all. Sri Lanka's sudden shift to organic farming have tended to be myopic and have not only disrupted the country's resilience in some agricultural commodities, but have also ripple effects on other macroeconomic parameters. Protecting the most valuable players. The Sri Lankan government has not been able to undertake any concerted efforts towards reviving the tourism industry since 2019. And finally, the last point is to not borrow to the hilt. Sri Lanka's habitual borrowing from creditor nations and multilateral organizations took a precarious turn when the composition of its foreign debt structure started shifting towards commercial borrowings in the form of ISBs. The impact of these exogenous shocks on regional economies, such as the South Asian nations, has been brutal. To be sure, the pandemic has provided a strong stimulus for economic resilience. However, the lack of resources, coupled with skewed policies driven by domestic and global politics, have often led to economic crisis, especially in the global south, such as South and Southeast Asia. Now, coming to the last slide, I want to thank you all for hearing me out so patiently. Over to you, Preeti.
Thank you, Soumya, for providing a comprehensive analysis of complex interplay of domestic and international economic factors that are crucial for charting a steady recovery process for Sri Lanka. And you've also raised some relevant red flags for developing countries as they plan for their post-pandemic economic readjustments. I would now move to our panelists to reflect on Soumya's paper and also discuss some other relevant issues concerning the crisis in Sri Lanka. Sreya, I'll come to you first. President Rajapaksa resigned after fleeing to Singapore. And before stepping down, he made Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe acting president. Mr. Wickremesinghe has declared a state of emergency across the country, and it has also imposed a curfew in the Western province while he claims that he's trying to stabilize the situation. Now, the president's departure has created a potential power vacuum in Sri Lanka. The country needs a functioning government to tackle the financial crisis. The G7 group of countries are willing to support Sri Lanka in reducing its debt repayments. Even the World Bank has agreed to lend Sri Lanka $600 million, and India has offered at least $1.9 billion. The IMF is also discussing a possible $3 billion loan. What is required is a stable government that could raise interest rates and taxes to help fund the deal. So any bailout may be delayed until a new administration is in place. Now, my question to you would be, do you think the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the president can give some semblance of political stability and assuage public anger? Now, this question is important because protests in Sri Lanka are visibly against the establishment of which Ranil Wickremesinghe has been a part for a very long time. Over to you, Sreya.
Thank you so much for your questions, ma'am. At the outset, let me thank ORF for inviting me to be a panelist in this discussion today. And I profusely thank Soumya Bhowmick for enlightening us with extremely relevant points and a very, very comprehensive analysis, like you said. I am not an economist myself. I do not have training in the discipline of economics, but the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, even for scholars of political science and international relations like myself, we cannot really evade, the telling statistics which are staring at all of us. I would come to your question, ma'am. Just allow me to draw your attention to three statements that I make in this connection, in connection to Soumya's paper. What I found fascinating about Soumya's paper is how there is a historical narrative of the economic policies in Sri Lanka, for the past decade or so, how gradually every aspect of a sound economy has actually been eroded. And for a country, an island nation with such a lot of potential, a population of 22 million, this has really been telling. Because not only has Sri Lanka been a country which is ravaged by a very long, protracted ethnic conflict, but unfortunately, and this is where I bring in my viewpoint on the crisis as well as to Soumya's paper, the problem has been structural, systemic, and also personalistic. So, like I said, that my first submission is that Sri Lanka's economic crisis is actually through the corridors of politics, through the corridors of political corruption and nepotism, and this is known to all of us. But what is saddening is that even in a time like this, and now I directly address your question, that Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was hastily made acting president when Gotabaya Rajapaksa finally capitulated and left the country, fled the country. But Ranil Wickremesinghe's appointment as the president was at the cost of overlooking three very important and relevant facts. One is that Ranil Wickremesinghe has been despised by a majority of the people in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lankan politics has been riding the wave of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. And Ranil Wickremesinghe's proximity to the Rajapaksa family, his involvement during the war, and also his very, very close relations with personnel in the military. This has been severely criticized by the people at large. And these are the people who are on the streets right now. 104 days of protests, very severe protests. Also, Wickremesinghe is directly accused of having discriminated against Tamils for many, many years now. And his party, the United National Party, fanned ethnic tensions. It is accused of organizing attacks against Tamils and even orchestrating the colonization of the north and the eastern parts of Sri Lanka and forcibly evicting Tamils out of their home. So not only is he accused of crimes, literal crimes against the people, to ignite controversies around him even further, the first thing that he did when he assumed charge, not as president, but as acting president, also later on as president on July 14th, is that he gave, a free runway to the military. And his exact statement, I believe, was that anything and everything has to be done for the sake of maintaining order. Now, in a country which has literally descended into what scholars like Neil Devota are now calling kakistocracy, and they've been saying this for a while now. Kakistocracy basically means, for the uninitiated, if I may point this out, kakistocracy is basically, the rule by the worst civilians of the country. So the sad fact of the matter is this, that Ranil Wickramasinghe may try his best, but my observations in the media has been that, he was very shaky right from the start, and he was going on saying that this is not a crisis which will be over soon. And after having assumed charge, which again, mind you, has been basically through the back doors, because how he has, legitimized his becoming the president is procedurally correct, but his party has not been able to win the majority of the seats. So the crisis, the political crisis in Sri Lanka, and the way I see it, is something that Sri Lanka has to deal with for a long time to come now, because they have, Sri Lanka is a very resilient country, and I agree with Shomo, what his submission at the outset, that my heart goes out to my friends and colleagues who have been there, whom I have known for a very long time now. But the way I see it, the people, the citizens, for the last 10, 15 years almost, they have come to this very strange place in their democracy, where although it is procedurally a democracy and there are regular elections, periodic elections, it is severely compromised, it is dysfunctional, and there are even, there is even academic scholarship which says that it is no longer a democracy, it is an ethnocracy. And now again, of course, like I said, it has degenerated into kakistocracy. But to my mind, I mean, beyond all those jargons, what is important is this, that the people in Sri Lanka, if you look at the war and post-war Sri Lanka may be post the war, but it is not past the war. And since then, since the war, although they got an opportunity when they voted Maithripala Sirisena to power, thereafter, for the sake of appealing to the Buddhist, Sinhala Buddhist nationalists, to gain, greater credibility amongst the Sinhala population, Sirisena also, took some very hasty moves, unconstitutional moves, like sacking Prime Minister Ranil Wickramasinghe and making Mahinda Rajapaksa the Prime Minister in 2018, end of 2018. And thereafter, we know this, that the voting of autocrats to power in Sri Lanka seems to have formed into a cycle or a pattern that people are unable to break off. And unless they do that, responsive governance, of course, a responsive governance, a responsible government is what can bring about sound macroeconomic policies, like you were saying, ma'am. So to bring about a responsive governance and responsible government, it is very important for people to realize that pandering to the majoritarian ethnic sentiments and, playing on this psychology of war, securitization, because people are afraid of war, people are afraid of violence. The 2009 Easter attack had a huge role to play, like you all know, in Gotabaya Rajapaksa's winning the elections in 2019. So Sri Lanka is psychologically still, in the post-traumatic stress disorder phase, and my heart goes out to that, to the people. But it has to come out of this pattern, this cyclical pattern of voting autocrats, because behind all that, bad economic decisions, like Soumya very rightly pointed out to all of us, it was actually the vested interests of the Rajapaksa family. They time and again went to the Chinese, and they were fascinated by debts. They got themselves into the sovereign debt trap simply because the Chinese at the same time were giving a lot of gifts and freeways to the Rajapaksa family and their clans. The clan and the friends. So the vested interest of the Rajapaksas, the greed, the corruption, has actually brought Sri Lanka into this Chinese debt trap, because China, as we know, it's a pattern, it's a strategic economic method that they use for the smaller neighbors in Asia. So India, of course, India, if this is a good moment for India to step in, and India has always been Sri Lanka's friend. Prime Minister Modi recently congratulated.
Sreya, you'll have to wind up. I want to give chance to Benislos.
Sure, ma'am. I don't want to extend any further. I think I've made my points. Just one last point on India-Sri Lanka relations, that India has always been committed to Sri Lanka's democratic revival as well as its economic recovery. But I think, what Sri Lanka needs right now is not so much assistance. It will need that for the bailout, of course. But in the long term, like I said, it is the internal political crisis which it has to solve to bring back a more stable government, and that would lead to stable economic policies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sreya. Thank you. Now coming to you, Benislos, in April 2022. Sri Lanka briefly shut down social media sites in an attempt to contain protest against the declaration of a state of emergency in the country. There was also a spike in censorship and information regulation, which has continued in varying degrees. Now, my question to you, I have a couple of questions, and I'll ask all three of them right now. I have three questions for you, and then you can answer in an order you like. My question is, how do online blockades of this kind impact a digital storytelling platform like yours? I read on your platform, you mentioned that digital storytelling is an educational initiative to empower youth with skills of citizen journalism and digital literacy, to tell stories of and from their communities and reclaim their narratives. Now, from here, I move to question 2, which would be, how do you ensure that your narratives stay relevant at times when the freedom of expression is curbed, with a real risk to the safety of reporters and storytellers? And finally, have the COVID crisis and the current volatility in Sri Lanka affected the nature of media consumption? Do you think the online media are ousting the traditional media? Over to you, Benislos.
Thank you very much, Preeti, for that kind introduction. And thank you, ORF, for having me in this seminar. And I should thank Bhowmick for setting the stage very clearly, especially as you very well asked, right? In the online world we are living in right now, one of the biggest problem we are facing is the problem of disinformation, and how the disinformation has been weaponized by the government and the government actors, and famously the existing regime itself. And for anybody who is going to spread disinformation about the ongoing economic crisis, and those who are going to just blame it on COVID, I think I have a finest piece of writing, which is very comprehensive, very well researched, and very well broken down, as pointed out by Soum in his article, just breaking down clearly what has led to the debacle that Sri Lanka is facing right now. So just to address your first question about the impact of the online blockades, right? And how does it affect the Sri Lankan media landscape right now? So I would say, like, we have two ways of looking at the problem that is currently happening. Being somebody who comes from the north, who comes from the minority community, who has like consistently been affected or being at the receiving end of the war, I can say from the first person perspective that this is something we are not seeing for the first time. For example, the north and the east has been affected with some of these worst economic man-made crises for a long time, especially during the 3-decade lasted civil war. And also the declaration of state of emergency or weaponization of the existing laws and the legal framework against the communities has already been faced by the minorities, right? But what is new right now is how this is used against the majority of the people, right? The very people who put Rajapakshas in power, the very people who elected the majoritarian government in power. And how this is systematically very different is this existing government right now, which is called SLPP, Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. They have 2/3 majority in parliament. They won the presidency with overwhelming majority, where the former president Gotabaya Rajapaksa, like the votes he got alone with the Sinhalese was enough for him to get elected. And he came out on his victory speech and said, I do not need any minority votes. And remember, I got elected only by majority votes. The reason why I'm citing this is the very fact that how the political players, as Sreya suggested, kept pandering to the ethno-religious narratives, right? And some of these symbols has already been detected by the minority communities, and they kept recurring. But what is the turning point right now is it is the first time where there is a collective awakening of public consciousness. So many people have asked me as a Sri Lankan, how would you characterize the Aragalia movement? Aragalia in Sinhalese means it's struggle, right? How would you characterize it, right? Or what do you think? What is the reason for the success of it? Although people could choose to disagree, but the amount of change that has been done in a short period of time cannot be looked apart. The prime minister has resigned, who was Mahinda Rajapaksa. The president has resigned, who is former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Finance minister has resigned, Basil Rajapaksa. The Rajapaksa clan has resigned as a whole. The central bank governor, who was the closest Rajapaksa proxy, has resigned. And there has been a massive overhaul. And thanks to those who have been protesting. And what has led to this is the collective awakening of the public consciousness and the first time realizing that there is need for accountability, right? And for far too long, anytime the question about accountability or the narrative about accountability comes into play, the simplest tool the majoritarians have again and again used, it's a Western conspiracy, or it's an NGO agenda, or it's the foreign forces that are working against us. But for the first time, people have felt how it feels like to be kicked in their gut with these ongoing economic crises, right? So as we see there is a massive awakening of the public consciousness, people are also starting to recognize these internet blockades are just the extension of the limitations that are put on freedom of expressions. For far too long, it was put in the North and the East that has systematically and institutionally been oppressed, but now it has been extended to the rest of Sri Lanka. Why? Because the political class has been challenged by the totality of the Sri Lankan population, right? So how do we deal with this, right? How, as a platform, deal with these online blockades? How, as a platform, deal with this curbing of freedom of expression? So in Sri Lanka, like in many other countries, we have a bigger problem where the mainstream media has systematically been politicized. And the politicization of mainstream media has been a main factor that kept polarizing the masses along ethnic religious lines, but also it kept polarizing along party lines. Thus, it helped the regime after regime to sustain their power and to evade accountability. But the storytellers, the journalists, the activists, with this mere tool of mobile phone, managed to create a revolution. And how do I mean by revolution? A single hashtag that said "Go Home Gota 2022" kept trending from the early this year. And the simple hashtag started revolutionizing into a movement where it brought people from all over Sri Lanka into a common place to challenge the status quo. So I believe where there has been, and I would just simply present what's the premise of storytelling, right? Why is it necessary? The simple premise is that for far too long, the traditional media organization that are systematically politically aligned has managed to divide the populace. But then again, people have found a voice using social media. One of the funniest things that happened was when the president's house, people started protesting outside of the president's house, they announced the state of emergency and they blocked the whole social media, right? What happened was people started using VPNs, and the Go Home Gota hashtag started trending all over the world. Thus, the whole world also started to take notice, right? Thanks to the social media blockade, I'm of course meaning it in a sarcastic way. It helped to crystallize this message all over the world, right? Thirdly, if we look at it, okay, what has it produced? Now, at least on July 24th, we remembered the 39th year, as Sreya also pointed out, of the Black July. 3,000 Tamils and 3,000 Tamils were killed. They were burnt, they were cut down, and they were killed by the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe's uncle, great uncle, J.R. Jayawardena, who was the first executive president of Sri Lanka, who laid the foundation for the Prevention of Terrorism Act and everything that followed, and state of emergency, right? There was not a single acknowledgement that came from the political establishment. But in the social media, one of the heartwarming moments for me was to see that people from the majority community they've started creating posts saying this was not taught to us on our curriculums. This was never shared. I did not even know, but thanks to you. And some of the people came and say, I am sorry for the mistakes my forefathers have done to you. And that creates the genuine bond. And if I can say one incident that has really helped crystallize the whole struggle for me, is the remembrance of the War Victims' Day on May 18th, right in front of the presidential secretariat, right outside of the Gota Go Gama village. Why is it significant for me? Coming from North, I've seen how people were systematically brutalized and killed, right? And having come through the war, I know and I have heard the first-hand accounts of people. But for far too long, except for the North and East, the rest of Sri Lanka said, no, this is the War Victory Day. This is the day to celebrate our war heroes, who is the military. But this year, for the first time, the juxtaposition against the corridors of power, there was a monument, people from Sinhala community, the majority community, the people from the Muslim community, people from the Tamil community, and people as a whole came and said, hey, we are sorry. We stand with you. We don't want to remember this as a day of victory, but we want to remember those who died. And those are also our brothers and sisters. So for me, as a storyteller, as someone who wants to work in this political space, as someone who believes in working with people, what does this struggle mean? Yes, the economic struggle continues. Yes, the struggle for accountability continues. But as somebody who counts even small wins as big wins, coming from the minority community, even the awakening of the public consciousness means a big step. Because if you really ask me, in 2019, when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa got elected with 6.9 million votes, and when he came and said, like, I got elected with the majority votes and the minority doesn't count for me, as a minority, I was threatened. And I was looking at the ways how I can work with the community at large. I'd never imagined the time that he would be driven out of office because he was the war victor, he was considered the savior. But people came together. And as so well pointed out in his research, people are starting to take notice. People want a systemic change. And why this moment is crucial, and I hope the political class and the status quo listen to the people, is because we cannot afford to make one more mistake. Because the people who are already lying, now almost, I think if I'm not mistaken, 17 people have died in queues. And there are almost 500,000 people who have already fallen into the lines of poverty. People are dying without medicines. And everyone is warning the food shortage is coming. And it is the time for the political class to listen to us because they are already going to survive. and they have got their cronies elected in their own ways, but the people are going to die. And next time a revolution comes, it's not going to be non-violent, because people are angry and they're legitimately angry. So, and there are so many people who can't feed their families more than 2 meals a day. And I know my friends who goes to law school with me who come from such similar backgrounds. So Sri Lanka cannot afford to make one more mistake. And such grave limitation of people's rights would only cause even further repercussions. And I hope the political class listens to this message that are sent from people. Thank you.
Thank you, Benislos. Can I ask you one more question? I mean, since we are talking, this is about the, something which has been interesting me sort of personally is about the startup ecosystem in Sri Lanka, right? We have seen that the ecosystem has been accelerating steadily over the past decade, and Sri Lanka is ranked second in the South Asian region for ease of launching a startup business. This is by the 2021 edition of the Global Startup Ecosystem Report. Now, this massive startup ecosystem has been continuously nurtured and developed with the support of global investors, beneficial partnerships, events, and boot camps that provide young entrepreneurs with a wealth of knowledge. The focus has been on the growth, on growing the number of startups. Now, while the pandemic increased stress on many communities, industries, and value chains, massive job losses were created with record rates of entrepreneurship. So I'm particularly interested in the challenges that startups are facing or have faced during the pandemic, and how they've converted, converted these challenges into opportunities for generating employment for the youth, and launching a range of digital services that have helped people connect to resources and essential services during this time of crisis, including during COVID-19 pandemic. What is your take on this?
Thank you, Sreya, for that question again. So during the pandemic, and this is also again goes back to this saying, which is popularly used in Sri Lanka also, we take one step forward and 2 steps backwards. In the Sri Lankan, one of the things that we have consistently been seeing in Sri Lanka is we have only 50% internet penetration in Sri Lanka. So that internet connectivity itself seems to be a bigger challenge in Sri Lanka. But as you said, a lot of startups have pivoted when the COVID-19 happens, and they quickly adapted the business strategy, and they've quickly tried to adapt to the situation. But more than the COVID-19, the startup take a big hit when the economic crisis start to crystallize, especially in the start of this year. For example, especially during the people's struggle itself, there has been repeated statements by the ICT community, by the startup community, again and again, especially about the power cuts. There was unprecedented 14-hour power cuts in the months of March and April that happened when the fuel crisis started to emerge. And one of the things that we are constantly seeing right now that is also not very well documented or very well reflected in a lot of reports as they're coming out, because it just keeps happening, is the brain drain that are happening. And one of the things the story after story we keep hearing is how many startups are just completely migrating out of Sri Lanka, and they're trying to find stable economic havens where they can go find steady investors. And also, one of the biggest hit that we took right now because of this economic crisis is also that we have heavily lost the investor confidence, and people are not willing to come and risk their money. And I opened up the Twitter this morning, and I was accidentally reading it, and somebody was saying, if you had 100,000 rupees in your account right now at the beginning of this year, it would be roughly worth around 55 to 60,000. And that's how much the rupee have depreciated. So in these dire economic conditions, startups are definitely facing the brunt of it. And also there has not been systematic support from the government itself, because in the earlier times, as you said, there has been consistent support that was given by the government itself. But as we run out of forex currencies, and as we run out of the confidence from the investor communities, it is consistently facing a threat. And also, we are consistently seeing startups are moving outside of Sri Lanka, and a steady political leadership and a solid economic plan of recovery can be a quick fix to fix the problem.
Thank you, Benislos. Moving to you, Sreya. I mean, my last question, and we have to be sort of very quick. This is you know, you have partially answered that in your first response. I mean, when I asked you. So, I mean, you know, now this crisis, I mean, the evolving crisis in the neighborhood is something that India cannot afford to ignore. I mean, you know, it is not just, you know, we don't see it as a foreign policy challenge that requires dialogue, but an economic challenge that demands resources. Now, a neighborhood first policy is very much in India's interest, and the crisis is also an opportunity to create mutually beneficial, people-oriented regional frameworks for stability and prosperity. And in the geopolitical standoff with China, the importance of maintaining positive influence with Indian neighbors cannot be understated. Now, what would be your take on this?
Yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right. And as far as, you know, the neighborhood goes, I mean, India is trying to gain its leverage gradually, you know, by, especially we have seen this, that after, you know, the ascendance of Prime Minister Modi, the neighborhood policy has been, you know, fueled through soft culture diplomacy as well, and not just in terms of hard power. So we see a lot of people-to-people connection. We see a lot of, you know, goodwill gestures that often come from India's side, they're initiated from India's side. But with Sri Lanka, India has had a very, very symbiotic relationship, you know. And Sri Lanka is one of those few countries where India took the initiative to militarily even intervene, you know, in the 1980s, because it was not only because of, you know, the shared Tamil population that both the countries have, but also given the fact that, you know, the south of India is always very sensitive about what is going on in Sri Lanka. So as of now, I think India has, you know, maintained two stances simultaneously, and it has done so, I think, in a very tightrope walking sort of a way. One is to say that, you know, Sri Lanka's internal crisis is its internal matter, and I think when Mahinda Rajapaksa was visiting India about as the Prime Minister a few years back, he had maintained this, that he respects the fact that India has always been very careful of not treating into Sri Lanka's, you know, domestic matters or making any untoward statements to that end. But at the same time, you know, since the 1990s, the successive Indian governments have maintained this, that there has to be, you know, a solution to the constitutional autocracy that Sri Lanka is gradually heading towards. And it has spiraled towards that in these last few years very drastically. But at the same time, economically, India has emerged as one of the largest assistance providers of Sri Lanka, and it has extended not only you know, credit facilities and you know, development aid. It has currency swaps, etc. But what I find very interesting is that even in you know, multilateral arrangements in forums like the World Bank and the IMF, India has done a lot to, you know, encourage other members of these plurilateral or multilateral framework, forums to invest in Sri Lanka and to encourage Sri Lanka to come out of its, you know, economic crisis, especially in the post-pandemic situation. So I think it is doing a lot tangibly as well as intangibly, and it is fulfilling its role as a neighbor. But having said that, one last point that I would draw all of your attention to, like Benislos very carefully, very nicely articulated, is that as long as this regime is in power, it is very unlikely that India would, you know, gain precedence over a country like China, because even though China has been cold shouldering Sri Lanka ever since this economic crisis sort of you know, bursted, even then, I mean, given this regime's penchant for, you know, going into this, literally walking into debts and, getting foreign currency over, encouraging domestic production. I don't think unless that stance really changes economically for Sri Lanka, India would be able to make the leeway that it ideally should as a neighbor.
Thank you, Sreya. Thank you. Shomu, coming back to you, I have two questions for you very quickly. We are running out of time. Very quickly. The first one is, what are the implications of the Sri Lankan crisis on South Asian neighborhood? It would be interesting to know your take on it, if at all there are any. If at all there are any implications. And my second question is, this is slightly different. This is, until recently, the island nation was hailed for leading the South Asian region in the Human Development Index. Sri Lanka has been leading in most of the socio-economic indicators such as health, education, and demographic characteristics. But despite its progress on many global development indicators, Sri Lanka is experiencing an unprecedented socio-economic crisis. Now, what does this have to say about the efficacy of the indicators, the global indicators, or what is it that most indicators have missed out on? Your thoughts, Shomu.
Thank you for the questions, Preeti. I'll be very quick and objective with this. I'll start with the first one. So, in terms of implications, I don't really think there are very major implications which will have ripple effects on the other South Asian economies. Mainly because, like I mentioned in my paper as well, the Sri Lankan crisis is a very unique one. Why I'm calling it a unique crisis is because, number one, unfortunately, these policies such as tax cuts right before the pandemic, organic farming right during the pandemic, these are policies which are very unique to the country. It's not something that you can generalize for the neighborhood, which has led to such, a meltdown of this proportion. Secondly, Sri Lanka's systematic way of restructuring in macroeconomics, where the current account deficits are being subsidized by external borrowing, this has structurally weakened the macroeconomics, which I again think is quite unique to Sri Lanka. So overall, I think there will be some short-term effects, but I don't think there is a much implication that we have to look in terms of Sri Lanka's crisis extending to other countries. Now, quickly coming to your next question about indices, very interesting questions. But indices have their own biases. Let's be honest about it. The World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, like we know, was disrupted last year. It was discontinued because of methodological errors. Again, for Sri Lanka, I think these indices did portray, some aspect of the truth, but there is a more structural fault with the indices in general, which I would like to point out are, number one, these indices don't take governance factors into consideration, which, makes which is a large loophole when you're making these rankings. Secondly, is that I also feel that a lot of these indices are static in nature. They don't take into account the changes in the parameters, the dynamism, the resource base of what indicators you're looking at. So, these are the loopholes that makes these indices a little bit faulty. So I think that is what happened in the Sri Lankan case as well, and in terms of indicators in general.
Thank you, Shomu. We have completely run out of time. And, I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Sreya. We hope to see you all in the next edition of Fellow Seminar at ORF. Thank you again. And, see you all. Thank you.